In this video, we'll go over 10 major lore characters, or powerful beings, who ended up as random dungeon bosses. And at number 10, we have the most dangerous and infamous boss of all the other ones on this list, and that's Hogger, who's the final boss of the Stormwind stockade. Now, I'm partially joking about this one. Hogger is more of a meme in the WoW community because he killed so many new players in the human starting zone, as he was originally a quest objective who was most times the first elite mob players would come across, as the majority of players in the early days of WoW were humans, and it wasn't really possible to solo Hogger the first time you ran into him, unless you were a really good character and prepared. So he became infamous as an incredibly difficult creature, who was very deadly, despite the fact that less people died to him than the Defias pillagers in the adjacent zone. So, in the Cataclysm revamp, when they recreated the human starting zone, they adjusted the quest with Hogger to make him much easier to kill. And when you did actually manage to kill Hogger, he wouldn't actually die and instead be arrested. And then he would be taken to the Stormwind stockade, where he eventually plans a revolt, and you're sent in there to calm things down to defeat Hogger once and for all. Although putting Hogger as a dungeon boss is actually incredibly appropriate for him, considering his minor infamy. So all the other spots on this list will be of much more importance. And at number 9, we have Lilian Voss in the Scholomance dungeon. Now, for non-Horde players who don't know who Lilian Voss is, she starts off as an NPC in the Undead starting zone, and you help her go through the zones as she tries to get revenge on the Scarlet Crusade, who turned on her as soon as they found out she was undead. But to be fair, to expect anything else was kind of her own fault, because the Scarlet Crusade has always been crazy and their whole shtick is killing the undead. Anyways, her story continues on into some of the dungeons, where she's tracking down a necromancer in Scholomance. But then the necromancer mind controls her, because you know, she's undead, and you have to fight her as one of the dungeon bosses, where after you beat her, you just free her from mind control, and then she helps you defeat the final boss. Lilian Voss was shown as being ultra powerful in the undead starting zone, as she could single-handedly take down groups of Scarlet Crusade members by herself. So her being a powerful dungeon boss kind of made sense. And then Lilian Voss started having occasional minor roles in lore after this dungeon, popping up in the Rogue Order Hall, and then becoming a major player in Battle for Azeroth, as she is the de facto undead leader after Sylvanas and Nathanael's left. Although her being a dungeon boss was a mind control situation, and you don't actually kill her, but she is a very important character who did end up as a dungeon boss, so she makes this list, if only at a very low spot. And at number 8, we have Vincent Godfrey, who shows up as the final boss in the Shadowfang Keep. Vincent Godfrey holds the achievement that only 2 other people have accomplished in lore, managing to kill Sylvanas. The first one was Arthas the Lich King, who killed her in the first place and turned her into an undead. And the other person who killed Sylvanas was herself, and since she is a major lore character and is the driving factor of the next expansion, this is quite the accomplishment. And this character managed to kill her by pretending to be on her side after she raised him during the Silverpine quest chain, in which case he sneaks up behind her and shoots her in the back of the head, and then immediately runs away to Shadowfang Keep, where he's dealt with as a dungeon boss, because he wasn't really worth more than that, to be completely honest. He is an important lore character, and was able to accomplish quite the feat, even if it was done through trickery and not through brute strength, which definitely allows him to make this list, just not at a high spot. And at number 7, we have Anub'arak, who was killed in the Azjol-Nerub dungeon in Wrath of the Lich King. Now, Anub'arak was a major character who helped Arthas get to the Frozen Throne before Illidan, and played a huge part in the Lich King's eventual success in that goal. You see, a little backstory for Anub'arak. The Nerubians fought a war against the Lich King in Northrend, where they were actually doing a very good job of winning because they were naturally immune to the Plague of Undeath. So the Lich King had to have his necromancers raise them manually if he wanted to recruit them into his ranks. And since Nerubians were also experts of guerrilla warfare, the Lich King was basically forced to have a war of attrition, and since he had an undead army that only got stronger the more it fought, he eventually won this war and was able to raise Anub'arak as his most powerful minion. So when Arthas came back to Northrend because his powers were weakening, he had Anub'arak personally escort him to the Frozen Throne, and allowed him to navigate the underground city of Azjol-Nerub to take a shortcut, and even helped fight Illidan's forces while the Lich King fought Illidan one-on-one. And so when Anub'arak finally appeared in World of Warcraft in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, players were kind of disappointed to see that he was defeated as a dungeon boss in a pretty short dungeon. So Blizzard brought him back in the Trial Crusader raid as the final boss, kind of randomly though. So they did eventually do him justice by making players kill him for a second time in the same expansion, but the fact of the matter is, he originally was just killed as the end boss of the dungeon, despite his major lore character significance, and is a good example of what this list is all about, except some of the others weren't given the luxury of also having a raid fight. And at number 6, we have Archaedas from the Uldaman dungeon. Archaedas is a Titan Keeper in the same vein as Odin, Raden, Thorim, all raid bosses because of how powerful they are in lore. You see, the Titan Keepers were created to fight the old gods, when they had a firm control on the planet, since the Titans themselves were too big to actually go onto the planet and fight them in a precise manner. And after the Titan Keepers won the war, they were basically left in charge of the planet while the Titans went away. But then the Titan Keeper Loken betrayed everyone, and Archaedas went into hiding with the Disc of Norgadon, which kept a record of everything that Loken had done. Loken was very desperate to get these back, but he was never successful in that, as Archaedas was able to hold up in Uldaman and keep them safe. That was until a group of adventurers broke in, ransacked the place, woke Archaedas up, who had put himself in a deep sleep, and then just killed the guy like he was a random nobody. As far as I know, Archaedas is confirmed dead, and players were able to steal his treasures and the Disc of Norgadon, and I find that kind of funny. Now, all of this happened in Vanilla WoW when Titan lore wasn't super grounded yet, and the Titans were a little bit different in lore than what they eventually became after a long series of retcons. And even after all of those retcons, they still let Archaedas die to a random group of adventurers who came in to steal his stuff, which is actually pretty great. And at number 5, we have Kael'thas Sunstrider. Now, technically, this character was killed in a raid. It's kind of like the reverse of Anub'arak, where he first shows up as the end boss of a raid, gets killed, gets brought back to life, then becomes a boss in a different dungeon later on in the expansion. So his final appearance in the game is as a random dungeon boss, and fits this list pretty well, because for those of you who don't know Kael'thas' story, he was a major character in Warcraft 3, and eventually joins up with Illidan because the Alliance almost had him and his people executed. And all he wanted to do was cure his people's mana addiction after Archaedas destroyed the Sunwell. And Illidan was too busy dealing with his demon hunters and the Legion to help him out, despite the fact that he promised he would. Eventually, he got swayed by the Legion to join them, and then became a bad guy because Burning Crusade lore was kind of weird, and Kael'thas is pretty infamous for his line, "Tempest Keep was merely a setback," and is pretty much the example of Blizzard loving to reuse their characters as much as possible, since we will probably see Kael'thas again in the Shadowlands. And at number 4, we have Murozond from the End Time dungeon. Murozond is a major lore villain who's the leader of the Infinite Dragonflight, who is an army that has an infinite number of dragons that goes throughout time and just messes with things. The Infinite Dragonflight is actually such a big deal that there is at least one involvement with the Infinite Dragonflight in every single expansion. And the leader of this omnipresent threat was killed at the end of a dungeon, and that's basically canon for how he dies for reals. But then again, since he is an infinite time dragon, there's other versions of him out there still, so that doesn't really stop the threat. But also based on his own lore, the way he dies is exactly as depicted in the End Time dungeon. A bunch of random adventurers get sent there by his uncorrupted form, Nozdormu, and abuse the Time Stone in order to stop him because of his infinite dragonflight shenanigans. And because of the lore of this dungeon, they can't really have Murozond be a future raid boss without retconning this specific event, because the whole point of it was how this is exactly how Nozdormu will die, and if he dies in any other way, then it doesn't really make sense. So this super important boss, who has ties to almost every single expansion, basically has to stay a dungeon boss. But then again, they just kind of use him as a plot device in order to allow players to go back in time and see things anyway, so I don't think it's that big of a deal. And at number 3, we have Ner'zhul from the Shadowmoon Burial Grounds dungeon in Warlords of Draenor. Now, this was the alternate universe Ner'zhul, so I guess it's not that big of a deal, but also, this character was so super important to lore that it's almost comical that he was defeated in a dungeon. As you see, Ner'zhul was the original Lich King, and was also the person who blew up Draenor and created the Outlands, and was the first leader of the Horde. All of those things are pretty important events, and in Warlords of Draenor, he was one of the warlords. But there were lots of problems with the story in Warlords of Draenor, and not all of the warlords actually got dealt with in raids, as some of them were even killed during quests, which is lower on the totem pole for major lore character deaths than appearing as a boss in a dungeon. Although considering how Ner'zhul was probably the most lore important warlord out of all of them, it was quite a shock for everyone to find out that we'd be dealing with him in a dungeon, and kind of in an uneventful way. And that's why he takes such a high spot on this list, and could easily have taken the number 1 spot as well, I just put him at number 3 because it was technically the alternate universe version, so it's not as big of a deal. And at number 2, we have Murmur, Destroyer of Worlds, who appears in the Shadow Labyrinth dungeon in the Burning Crusade. Now, I'm sure most of you don't know who Murmur is. Basically, when the Shadow Council was trying to take Doom from the Draenei, they tried to use a new spell that Kil'jaeden had taught them to summon a powerful demon, since they were on the losing side. But they accidentally summoned Murmur instead, who is a cosmic entity from a faraway quarter of the universe, who's worshipped as a god by some planets, before he eventually kills them, since a single sigh from the actual creature is enough to destroy those planets. So what they summoned was an incomplete version of Murmur, which was enough to completely destroy and flatten everything in the immediate area, which definitely won the Shadow Council that battle. But since they had this avatar of a cosmic being in their control, it took everything they had just to lock it away so that it wouldn't destroy the rest of the horde. So when players go into the Shadow Labyrinth and fight Murmur, what they're doing is just trying to push him back and try to stop the Shadow Council from fully summoning the actual Murmur into the world, because he's just too dang powerful to exist on a planet. Now, you'd think the essence of sound and Destroyer of Worlds would be a much bigger deal, and not relegated to some B-plot of a random dungeon. But then again, this was the Burning Crusade, where their lore was a whole bunch of B-plots strung together to try to create a coherent story. So really, it just kind of fit in with everything else. As in one of the adjacent dungeons, you get to kill an Arakoa god in order to get a mount. So destroying a cosmic entity before you can enter the world and destroy the planet was kind of on the same level as everything else that was going on. And finally, at number 1, we have Loken, who was the final boss of the Halls of Lightning dungeon in Wrath of the Lich King. Now, Loken is another Titan Keeper just like Archaedas, except Loken is like the most important Titan Keeper out of all of them, as he's responsible for so many events that happen in Warcraft's history. You see, Loken was manipulated by Yogg-Saron through a long series of events, which eventually led Loken to betraying all the other Titan Keepers, imprisoning half of them, and causing the other ones to go into hiding, and releasing the Curse of Flesh upon the world, which is why all the characters in Warcraft are not made of stone and metal, as that's actually their default state. And this incredibly important lore figure canonically dies in the dungeon, and leads the way to the Ulduar raid with his death, where you find a whole bunch of other Titan Keepers who are properly raid bosses, and you eventually push Yogg-Saron back into his prison. And since Loken is involved in so many things, you can't really touch any of the stories in Northrend without Loken having some involvement in it. He is probably the biggest lore character who is actually important to the lore and from the main timeline that dies in a dungeon. But at least he went down as one of the hardest dungeon bosses of all time. Loken accumulated more dungeon deaths than any other boss in Wrath before Blizzard stopped announcing those stats, and Archaedas shared a pretty similar feat. He was an incredibly hard dungeon boss in Uldaman, even if he was a low-level dungeon. So, even if he wasn't given a proper raid, at least he was a little threatening when he was current content. But he definitely takes number 1 spot for just being a very important lore villain who was finished off in a dungeon. Alright, and that's the list. Do you think I missed any other more important lore characters who were killed off as random dungeon bosses than the one I put in the video? If so, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. And this video was edited by the Flying Buttress, who does lots of amazing work on his own, so everyone should go check out his channel and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.